In YouTube, I was watching a video recently by the Royal Armories. Jonathan Ferguson, I think, is the guy that hosts the show, and he talks about the firearms that the Royal Armory has in their collection, and some of them are very weird. And the guy is very knowledgeable about firearms to the point where he has actually written books about firearms. Yes, very knowledgeable dude. And recently he was discussing 17th century cavalry pistols, specifically about the fact that some of the early wheel locks were converted to snap hances at a later date. And what he thinks actually happened was that they did this because of material and cost measures. Um, it was kind of an interesting little video, even geekier than I get, so I can understand why many people may not be interested in it. But it got me thinking about the fact that when I've used horse pistols, which is a horse pistol is a longer musket. Like lots of muskets are big. Don't make me wrong, but a horse musket is a large pistol, and it would be carried. Two of them would be carried in sheaths on your saddle. So you'd pull one out, boom, pull one out, boom, and you slap him back in there. Or sometimes he would even turn him around and use him as a club. Um, uh, and I've used those in settings before because again, I'm a weapons dude. So you would have musket, you have pistol, then you'd have a horse pistol, and then you get into like a carbine or a blunderbuss, which are roughly the same size, and then you get into a full length musket. So giving the player characters options about what size weapons they want to carry and the damage they do. Um, and no, I don't remember what stats I used. I do not. Sorry. Um, and I've always had this kind of iconic image in my skull of dwarves using firearms, probably influenced by Warhammer miniatures. I believe, if I'm incorrect there, dwarves are known for carrying like blunderbusses and things like that. And the mental image of a dwarf carrying a blunderbuss or even a volley gun, look up volley guns. They're a group of 7 barrels like this. Very, very cool. I always thought was very dwarven. And if you're on an open pitched battle in like outside, firearms like that are an option. So are cannons and things like that. And if you have the technology in a high fantasy setting to use them, do it. I limit the accessibility by not using gunpowder, which is a pure chemical process, but using an alchemical material known as smoke powder, which means I can then constrain the volume available as much as I want to by making the ingredients more or less complex, kind of thing. Um, and I also, depending on if you can like have a specialized ignition system if you want, which again can put more of a bottleneck in the production of the firearms. Well, they're probably never going to be as ubiquitous as firearms were in our world because you have magic. And magic is far more versatile than a firearm, but it is a good way of giving someone who doesn't have a spell casting ability at least an ability to harm people at range. And it gives you some variety in the kind of load you can use in a firearm. So you might be able to meet different situations for like, silver or even adamantine rounds, that kind of thing, or cold iron rounds for that matter. But if you're a dwarf, a lot of your combat is going to be taking place in tunnels. And tunnels are not a great place for firearms. They produce big flashes, they produce huge amounts of smoke, and they are unbelievably loud, particularly in a stone tunnel. If you discharge a firearm in a stone tunnel, the user and quite possibly everyone around them is now deaf. They are not hearing anything. Not to mention, you have to have the propellant for your firearm, whether it's gunpowder or smoke powder, which makes it highly susceptible to being counterattacked by the enemy. And if they set off your keg of accelerant, you don't have a tunnel anymore, nor do you have the unit that was fighting. So, yes, there are major disadvantages to using firearms in tunnels, and that's where dwarves spend a lot of their time, in tunnels. And then it occurred to me that there's more than one way to propel a lead projectile down the barrel of a firearm than a powder, and that is air. Yes, air rifles are a real thing. Now, if you say air rifle in America in the modern era, you're probably going to think of a .177 caliber pellet, pistol or pellet rifle. A small caliber used for target practice. That's it. Or plinking at, like little metal plates and stuff like that. Um, they're great because you could for set up a bullet catch. They actually make bullet catches for things up to like a 22 caliber round. So you could set up a bullet catch in your basement, and you could use these inside, and they make almost no noise. There's no flash, there's no smoke, and it's very safe to use inside because you can use a bullet catch. And again, they're usable up to a 22 caliber. And pellet rifles or air rifles are available in larger calibers. They are available in 22, 25, even up to 45 caliber, which is a viable option for medium game hunting. The 25 caliber isn't still a viable option for small game hunting, like if you're going after squirrels and rabbits and stuff like that. Yeah, 25 caliber is perfect. I personally would like to have a nice quality 25 caliber air rifle. I don't have one at this point in my life, but I would like to get one someday. I think they're cool. And the air rifle also has a number of other useful characteristics. They have a tank. Now, in a high fantasy setting, you could have the tanks like be so they were built into the stock or built into the grip, the grip here or the stock here. That would be viable like a paintball gun. But in the historical early air rifles, and they've been around for centuries, they would use an actual spherical container because the sphere is the safest and easiest way of containing compressed gas. And they would fill them. They would have them detached from the firearm. They would pump them up, then they would screw them in place, and then they would fire the weapon, and it allows you to make multiple shots without having to replace the propellant because the propellant is the air in the tank. All you have to do is put the round in the firearm and you're good to go. So that's a big advantage. Now, before you're thinking, I did mention medium game hunting, but the air rifle was used by the military. In fact, Austria fielded an entire unit of air rifles at one point in their history. I think it might have been in the 18th century. Um, I'm not positive on that. And I believe it was the only instance where it was actually officially used on anything other than an individual basis. Because I can imagine somebody's probably used one as an individual out there. But as a unit, I think that was the only time. I'm not positive, but I think it was. So they are viable against human targets, but again, especially if you're using a 45 caliber, which is again available in the real world. In a high fantasy setting, it would be very easy to produce that. And if anybody's going to be able to come up with the technology to create containers to hold high pressure gas, it's going to be the dwarves. And they're perfect for tunnel warfare. They're perfect. No flash, no smoke, far quieter, and capable of making repeat shots as long as you're reloading them. So you could probably have this be set up so it was one shot per round. If you have the right gun designed right, and the person had maybe a multi-attack ability, say if we're using with 5th edition rules, then maybe they can even get 2 shots off a round. So that would be perfectly acceptable in my book. And they were also used as a force multiplier. What do I mean by that? Well, the Lewis and Clark expedition, when they were mapping out the Louisiana Purchase, brought along 2 air rifles. They were used to get medium small game, while they were out there in the field, because it meant that since you had a compression device to fill the air tanks, all you had to do was have rounds, and you had the lead rounds and the molds to make more lead rounds with you, but it meant you weren't using up your supply of gunpowder, which you'd be using against enemies for the most part. So you'd be doing this for just hunting to put stuff into the pot for food, but it would be not using up your very precious supply of gunpowder, black powder, I should say, because this expedition was the longest of long-range reconnaissance patrols. Okay, and they brought them along, and they demonstrated them to the indigenous people they encountered. Now, those folks knew what a firearm was. Some of them used firearms themselves, but they're using black powder muzzle-loading flintlock weapons. Okay, reliable, don't get me wrong, and in the hands of a skilled person, really dangerous. But they can only get that one shot off before you have to load it again from the end of the barrel. With the air rifle, They demonstrated that they could get multiple shots off without having to use gunpowder. And if you've never seen that kind of technology before, that's a sea change. Now, the expedition didn't say, all of us have these, but they also didn't say, none of us have these. So they, by giving a demonstration of weapons and showing that there were two of them, but giving a demonstration of weapons that could fire multiple times without needing to be recharged, that's a psychological force multiplier. There's an old military adage. If you have 5,000 men and your enemy thinks you have 10,000 men, you have 10,000 men. Because your enemy is now preparing themselves to face that kind of a force, which means they're going to be trepidatious. They're going to be dumping more of their resources into their military preparations while you are doing your thing over here. So force multiplying psychologically is important. It's one of the reasons that small units like the Special Forces tend to put a lot of lead downrange when they have to get into a firefight and they want to do it fast. They want to give their enemy the impression there are more of them than there actually are. And by the same token, that's a force multiplier. If your enemy thinks or knows you can put multiple rounds downrange without having to recharge the weapon, that's going to make them nervous. Now, just imagine being the first group of deep gnomes or the first group of, no, was it deep gnomes? It was deep dwarves. The Durger, or say goblins or kobolds that try to break into a dwarven tunnel to do some raiding or invasion and find themselves facing air rifles and not understanding the first time they hear that poof sound, and then one of their compatriots falls dead. Because it's going to be far quieter than a firearm, but it's still going to make an air rifle sound. Okay, so it's going to have a definite boom to it, but it's not going to deafen the people in the tunnel. So I think air rifles are the absolutely perfect weapon for dwarves in their minds. I've never seen it used in a fantasy setting, ever. Now, I could be wrong, but to the best of my knowledge, I have never seen it used, and it fits in perfectly, particularly if you're running a game where there's like electrotech or steam tech. This would then fit in seamlessly, and it would not look out of place at all. And because dwarves have access, most dwarves would have access to both water power in the form of underwater rivers and potentially steam power from geothermal, both of those energy sources would then help them run air compressors. If you can run an air compressor, you can fill up tanks very quickly. And air compressor concepts are not complex. If you can produce the types of technology that are seen in high fantasy settings, you can make an air compressor. And converting water power into something else is not difficult to do. The Romans were used water power. It's not a high tech thing. Most medieval settings have like windmills for grinding their grains. That's a conversion of air power to mechanical motion. And if you can do that, and if you know how to do it, you can convert that to producing air pressure as well. So there are methods out there for producing air pressure with machines that will be available to folks in a high fantasy setting. You could even probably adapt maybe some kind of magical ability to run an air compressor. You sink the magical cost into the air compressor, but then that means that the users are using air guns, which are non-magical. So you're husbanding your magical resources by only having to have that one magical thing at the source, and then anything else is piggybacking off of that source. So under certain circumstances, that may be a viable option if you have limited magical access to power. So yeah, so this is just an idea I popped into my head while I was at work one night thinking about 17th century horse pistols. Yes, that is weird that I spend my time thinking about things like that, but I do. Okay, let's talk about different weapon types for high fantasy settings than maybe are traditionally available. And I think air rifles fit in just perfectly in a high fantasy setting.